Welcome to today's presentation, the fear of speaking in public. Now, all of you are familiar with this, and at some point in your lives, at a marriage, in school, on some opportunity, perhaps in your job, you had to get up and you had to give an allocution in front of other people, and you felt this deep fear rising from within you that gives rise to a pounding heart, sweating palms, palpitations, a feeling of dizziness, and it can go so far as a complete panic attack. Well, actually, the etymology of the term is interesting. It's glossophobia, from the Greek, glossa, tongue, and phobia, a dread or fear, which at times is very difficult to control. So you may have asked yourselves, why am I, or why are people generally so scared of speaking in public? Over 80% of people, in fact, when questioned, put it as one of their highest fears. So that's something that produces a physiological reaction. So how can we explain this reaction? Well, the first most obvious one is the genetic theory. And that states that historically, and back in the time where we were still being selected in terms of survival, which is no longer the case now, for thousands and thousands of years, when people lived in very small groups, imagine back at the time of cavemen, for example, if you were excluded from your group, it was an absolute death sentence. So you had to be very careful, particularly if you weren't high up in the hierarchy, to not incur the wrath of your group. And there was a hierarchical system, and people spoke very little. You've all heard of the example of indigenous American tribes speaking very little. Well, there's actually a reason for that. And that is that when you're dependent on your group for your very survival, the more you speak, the more you can provoke dissension, argument, and ultimately rejection. Now, in today's society, of course, it's a little bit different. But we can think of some examples. For example, if you're in a very repressive regime and you speak out politically, or you're a relatively junior member in your company or in a law association and you speak out and you criticize, there can be some pretty dire consequences. Or if you say something, for example, to a group of people on which you depend, it could be within your church, you can be excluded. So there are still reasons to fear. But the original cause was a genetic one. Now let me give you an interesting example. There are tribes in Lapland that scavenge for food, basically, in sub-freezing temperatures, and they use reindeers to transport all of their belongings, and they strap their babies onto the backs of reindeer, and they're continuously on the move. Well, according to anthropologists, these are the only babies known to never cry. Well, it doesn't take too much, and you don't have to be Einstein to work out that these babies intuitively sense that survival conditions are very precarious, and if they make themselves too much of a burden for their parents, well, this could create a problem. Now, speaking of babies, let me mention the second explanation to why perhaps human beings are so scared of speaking in public. Well, the human being, unlike other animals and mammals, or the vast majority of them, are dependent on their parents in their infancy for several years. And so the tiny child and the baby, being so dependent for its survival, for being fed, protection, and shelter on its parents, feels itself to be in an extremely vulnerable situation. And those key years in between 1 and about 3, human infants struggle with a dilemma. Do I cry? Do I scream? Do I have tantrums? Which of course they do at times. Or do I contain myself because I'm dependent for my very life and being fed on my mother? So this explains again why human beings are particularly sensitive, and why on a physiological level it's inbred into us to be very sensitive to the possibility of abandonment and rejection. So when we think more about public speaking now, have you ever gotten up again? Have you, before you started speaking, started to feel your heart pounding and your palms sweating? This is typical when you're waiting your turn, maybe in a group, when it's going around the table and then you know you have to speak. Have you felt this particular experience? Because if you felt it, you probably never forgot it. It's a very strong psychological and physiological state to be in. Now at school, we know that children can be very cruel, and you can be very quickly excluded from a social group. If you come from a different ethical group than the majority, if you come from a different financial circumstance, if you dress differently, if your hair is curly, if your hair is a particular color. We know that children already have this tendency to exclude people. Everybody knows what it feels like, because either they've been there or somebody else has been there, to be the last one selected for a team, to be ostracized. This is a tremendous fear. And in fact, a lot of people, or I should say some people, prefer negative attention than no attention at all. They'll do something that'll bring some attention to them, dressing in a strange way and everything, because there's a real need for attention and deep down acceptance as human beings. So, whatever your profession is, whatever circles you move in, as I say, at some time you're going to have to get up and probably give some type of allocution in front of other people. So why not look at it this way? You're biologically programmed in a way to have a fear against that. But if you can supersede that fear, you should know a couple of things: that most audience members identify with the people that get up and speak in front of them, and they want that person to succeed because they imagine themselves in that circumstance. They know it would be difficult, and they hope that you succeed so that they can vicariously appreciate that triumph that you will have if you speak really well in front of other people. So you have to realize that most of the people in the audience are extremely sympathetic to what you're going to do. So if you found yourself in that circumstance and you're wondering, am I too old? Am I not educated, well enough educated? Do I not present well? Am I not good looking enough? Am I too fat? Am I too thin? And so on and so forth. Take this really as a challenge. That's what I'm proposing to you. Because at the end of the day, studies have proved some very interesting things. For example, if a speaker gets up and gives a perfect presentation and is very slick and conforms to the norms of society of what good looks are supposed to be, they'll get a fairly decent rating. But if that same speaker in front of another group accidentally, in fact, spills the coffee in an experiment and all of a sudden is in an embarrassing situation, then gives exactly the same speech, the rates of approval go up drastically, which undermines the fact that people identify with the person that speaks and they want him to succeed. It's a human, natural thing that people pull together. So I'm not going to go through tips on how to speak in public because this is not the purpose of this particular presentation. But there are some things that are important. If you practice a speech a lot until it becomes ingrained in you, it becomes like a second nature. And even if you're a little bit scared, you can push through. Become conversant and aware of who you're speaking to, nationality, cultural traditions, sex, ages, professional categories, and tailor your speech very much to the needs and to the listening of that particular audience, and that will generate a very sympathetic response. Another very effective way is relatively early on in the speech is enroll people to make comments and participate. Audience participation takes the light off of you and puts basically everybody in the same boat. That can be very effective. So next time you have the opportunity, I say, try to face your fear, get up, and do your absolute best. And bear in mind some of the things that I've said here. Supersede your fear in the knowledge that if you do succeed to speak in an eloquent and a convincing and an authentic fashion in front of other people, it will give you a lot of recognition and a deep sense of personal satisfaction. Thank you very much.